welcome to the Get Ready with Tony Stewart podcast in partnership with Insurance Nerds. I'm pleased to be joined today by Shennandoah Connor. Good morning.
Good morning.
In this episode, we'll be discussing behavioral economics and how advisors can focus on their clients' perspectives and issues. Shennandoah is a graduate of the Get Her Done School of Thought. Shennandoah Connor takes strategy and execution to the extreme, rapidly developing and implementing both client and company initiatives while maintaining high standards of excellence. She marries her experience training in change management and organizational development with her 20 plus years of experience providing marketing and strategy services for clients in the AEC struggling this morning, financial services, technology, and healthcare industries. She actively writes and speaks on topics related to marketing, leadership, and business for many conferences and organizations, including SXSW Interactive, Women in Finance, the Institute for Leadership and Capital Projects, the Society for Marketing Professional Services, the Women's Global Leadership Conference in Energy, and others. Yeah, that's a few things. As vice, keeps you busy. And Bush, you're a mom, right?
Yes, agree.
That's another full-time job. And as Vice President of Strategy and Client Services at Connor Creative, she is leading the implementation of new technologies and services while bringing their full suite of marketing and communications capabilities to the market. So there we go. That's about Shennandoah. So let's plunge in and learn more about you and what you're up to. So maybe, yeah, fantastic. So let's talk about how you got started.
Well, it's kind of a funny story. I started very, very young. I started learning about everything that I employ today, the sales, the marketing, how to influence people, how they think, what affects their decisions, actually in middle school. My father, sorry, there's a fly coming at me. My father was a farmer, but for health reasons had to change careers and went into sales at an RV dealership. But he's one of those, when he was going through learning everything that he needed to learn, he went through the Dale Carnegie stuff and all that. He came home and taught it to us kids. So I'm the oldest of three. And all of us went through sales training in elementary and middle
funny.
school. Because he was, that's how you learn. You teach it to others. And so that's what he was doing. We were his, captive audience, so to speak. So I started learning it then, and always worked with my parents in some capacity, working on the weekends or helping them out. I've always had a knack for writing. And so would help my dad with developing sales letters and things. But I really started kind of working as a copywriter and doing marketing support in high school. I wanted to participate in a pageant, but my parents were of the ilk that if you want something that's extracurricular, you have to figure it out yourself. And so they would allow us to get sponsors and sell advertisements in the program for the pageant. And but they didn't give us any sales materials for that. So I developed my own sales letter. Sorry, it's fly. It's just after me today. But yeah, I developed my own sales letter and got in my Sunday best and started going around to all the different companies where I grew up, which was Las Cruces, New Mexico. And I got the entire pageant paid for. Plus
fantastic.
Some gigs doing some sales letters. I was so good at it, they wanted me to help write their marketing materials. So that's how I got started. It always had been kind of a side gig until I had my daughter. I was a single mom with a 4-month-old baby and had to figure out a way to make a living in a way that, wasn't just, childcare is so expensive. And as a single parent, it was just very difficult. So I started freelancing again when she was born and quickly grew an agency from that. So kind of the roundabout way that it ended up.
Well, fantastic. Yeah, and let that fly know he can be booked next week.
He's really persistent. I don't know. I had the doors open earlier because it's a nice morning, but that was probably a bad idea.
Well, maybe it's a Dale Carnegie fly and, he's persistent.
Yeah, it's just to see how well my meditation on focus is working today.
Well, that's great. And I think one of the things you said that's just so important, and a lesson you learned early on, that it's about teaching others. It's what we learn
Mm-hmm.
but that the key is not selling, the key is teaching. And that's what I love about what you're doing and your school of thought. So let's get into, what you're doing today. What do you do?
Yeah, and kind of on that point right there, one of the things I do quite a bit, or what I call it, is educating to convergence. So I work with a lot of knowledge-based companies, their financial services or professional services, where they have very involved technical products and services that they deliver, and they're working mostly with B2B. Some of them are B2C. So we do a mix of both, where you have to really educate a client before they become a client and throughout the whole process. It's just part of the selling and customer service funnel that you need to be able to continually educate them. So there's a lot of blogging and thought leadership that happens through that. But it's also really thinking about translating really technical topics into terms and language and stories that the customer can understand and that they can relate to wherever they are in the process. And so that's a big part of what we do. There's a lot of different aspects that can go into it from a tactics standpoint, whether we're talking about social media or email marketing or doing strategic partnerships or webinars or events, those types of things. Those are just kind of the ways we go about really trying to connect with the right type of client that would be a good fit for whomever we're representing, and really just getting that thought leadership and expertise out there and educating them in a way that is bringing them along for the journey that's going to lead to a sell for our client, but that is ultimately going to lead to a positive solution and outcome for their end user as well.
Definitely. And I think that's another key thing. It's that it's about a positive solution, is that you want people to walk away feeling good about what they've done. I know so often in the financial services industry, is so often clients walk away and they're either puzzled or they don't feel great about the process. And, they have just this view of, especially the insurance industry, but I'd say across the whole financial services industry of like, yeah, these are people I got to deal with, but I don't really want to deal with them. It's like,
well, and I think a lot of that comes when you can feel when when they're not operating in your best interest, when they're trying to meet quotas or represent a specific product versus what's the best solution for the client. You can feel that sometimes, and you can walk away not getting that great experience if you know for a fact they didn't do the due diligence, even if it is maybe even the right product for you, but they didn't do that due diligence on the front end of really getting to know you and understanding what your needs were and drawing that connection between where you're at, what you need, what your goals are, your level of understanding, and what they're trying to provide to you. And that's where that disconnect can come into play quite a bit.
Great. Well, I think that leads well into our next question is, what is behavioral economics? I know that's one of your specialty areas.
And then with anything that they throw behavioral on top of, it just means we're applying psychology to whatever that is. So economics, classical economics, the models were based on, very perfect information. Everybody knew everything they needed to know. Everybody had the same negotiation power, and everybody always acted rationally. They didn't resist change. They knew it was necessary. They never did any impulsive buys. Everything was very logical and well thought out. And as humans, we know that's not true. We're not always logical. Most of the time we're not, actually, especially when it comes to finances. That's one of those things where people can make a lot of really unhealthy decisions that can impact them for a very long time because of emotional reasons. And so, but also anytime you're trying to influence someone, it's not just a logical decision or just an emotional or a decision or psychological based decision. It's a combination of the two. And so you have to understand both in order to really be able to not only, attract a client and keep a client, but to make the client happy. And that's part of where it comes into play. From an economic standpoint, it's more about that what incentivizes people, what influences their decisions. And then as a marketing person, that's what I look at is what influences people's decisions. When do they start, their ears start to perk up and they start listening? What makes them take that next step and what makes them stick around? what also keeps them from making those decisions that actually are good for them. There's a lot, again, with my background is also in change management, so resistance comes up quite a bit when you're dealing with anything, especially if there's, and we've talked about this before, if there's, people want to avoid thoughts of death, people want to avoid negative thoughts, but how do you get them to be proactive while also being, aware of they're going to have this resistance to certain topics or resistance to certain things, or they're going to have, a certain inherent bias to things. And that's basically what it does, is we're looking at all the different ways that influences their thought patterns, and how can we incentivize and motivate them to take the actions we want them to take or they need to take.
Exactly. So, and I think that's really, in the insurance industry, you're dealing with the first thing you hit on is people not really wanting to talk about money and feeling comfortable with money. And then you're also dealing with things that people don't want to talk about. They don't want to think about their house burning down, or getting in a car crash, or somebody dying or becoming disabled. Those are, not positive events. So how can advisors and other financial service professionals apply behavioral economics to better serve their clients and to help their clients deal with these issues while not being a trained psychologist?
Right. And like a lot of that honestly comes from the old adage of, just learning to listen and hear what they're actually saying. And so stopping and taking the time to get to know your client and hearing what their current pain points are. And if you can meet their pain points first and they start to trust you, they're going to listen to you more on some of these bigger things. So if you've got a young person or a newly married couple, they're not thinking about 50, 60 years from now, this happens, this might be an issue. They're thinking about, okay, we want to buy a house, we want to do this, and so thinking about where they're at, how can you help them meet those needs, be that trusted advisor, and really understand where they're going in their life, where they're at in life right now, build that trust, and then start incrementally moving them towards these other items. And then sometimes too, thinking about what are the things that they value, and how can you speak to those values or standards that they want to live by, and kind of draw that connection. So that's something we use a lot. So if you have someone who values themselves as a provider, they value themselves as someone that provides and protects for their family, appeal to that sense of being a provider in your discussions. Instead of coming from a doom and gloom standpoint, you're coming from you're taking care of your family standpoint. So it's not about loss, it's about protecting what's there and preserving what's there. Or if you have someone that is, I know we talked about this, a lot of women end up being caregivers and they're overwhelmed by a lot of these things. What can you do to address their concerns as a primary caregiver, either of young children or children with disabilities or aging parents or whatever their situation might be? Thinking about what are their pain points and how can you speak to those pain points and where they're at right now, solve their immediate problems, and start working them over towards addressing the other items that they need to address. So often everybody wants to come with, okay, here's a full package of everything that you need, or here's ultimately the best thing. And if they're not either there yet, or they're so overwhelmed by their current situation, to them that's like, okay, well, that's not what I need right now. Or like you said, or they're going to try and avoid that until they feel that they have a relationship and a bond with you. And until that's developed, it's really hard to really sell them on anything, much less the whole kit and caboodle. So that's typically how I advise our clients.
It definitely. Well, and I think is that what you're really saying is you have to, that people can't, and I found this myself, is sometimes, taking in the whole picture at a single time, at one point, it is kind of challenging, and you have to have people focus in on one component of the plan to start leading them through the entire plan. So how do you recommend, and how do you help people focus on one specific aspect of a bigger solution?
Well, part of that first is doing kind of your customer discovery. So really everything you have to start by understanding your customer first. So often clients come in and they want to sell a specific product, or they have their own goals that they're trying to reach. But in order for us to draw that connection between what the client, what they're wanting from an organizational standpoint, whatever quotas they're trying to reach, whatever products they're trying to sell, we have to first think about, okay, what is the audience that you're trying to reach out? What are their key pain points related to this? What are their concerns? What are their interests related to this? And we do that initial discovery first and think about, okay, how can we meet them where they are? And then start drawing those connections from, okay, here's where they're at, here's their pain points, this is what you offer, and working our way backwards to meeting them where they are and slowly bringing them along. And that definitely does mean having more steps in the process. And I have a lot of clients that are very high energy CEOs, and they want to, get there fast, and they want to convert right away and, just really make it happen. But really, for us to do it well, we've got to break it down, because we've all been there. If you get too much thrown at you at once, you just shut off. If you get too many emails at once, if you get this giant brochure with all this technical jargon in it at once, you're not going to go through it. But if you can get little incremental steps that address a specific point and has a single call to action, like this is your next step, and really thinking about it in those baby steps, from step A, step B, step C. Don't try and go from A to Z right away. And that's typically how we go about it. A lot of times it does help to have that outside perspective, because again, we're so jaded by our own wants and needs and goals as an organization. I'd get the same way, where you're focused on just trying to meet your own needs. It's hard sometimes for you to see the other side of the equation. And it's also sometimes hard for you to see where that starting point might be. As a lot of times it's not where the client actually starts engaging with you. It's not necessarily where you need to start engaging with them naturally. The example I use a lot of times is like with a hospital. So often they wait until a patient comes in. That's the point that the customer journey starts for them, but that's not when the customer journey starts. The customer journey starts when they start having symptoms and not feeling well. And that can be weeks or months before they actually show up in the hospital. And it doesn't end when they're discharged. It continues for several months after. So from where we're at, we have to think about, when are they going to start thinking about these decisions, and how can we start getting in front of them before it's time for them to actually make that decision and be that resource that's already positioned for them long before they actually have the need. So those are like the different steps that we take, really thinking about looking outside of your organization and understanding the client's needs, breaking it down into much smaller steps and starting with where they're at and slowly working them over with a very distinct value proposition or piece of information that has a very specific call to action afterwards. And then thinking about where the customer's journey really starts. And it starts long before they really actually need you. So it starts long before you really think it does.
Well, that's great advice. And, how, the question I have too is that there's a lot of people in the insurance nerds audience that are not directly interfacing with a client. Some of them are CEOs of insurance companies, and so a lot of people are removed, or they're in underwriting departments. How do people who are not directly interfacing with the clients think about this in terms of their work, and even just the work at the company, but helping the company move in that direction towards being client focused?
Yeah, and that's actually interesting, because I'm reading High Performance Habits right now by Brendan Burchard, and he just talked about the service component of his Focus 4. And it talks about that, really thinking about who the end user is. And so often, just because of technology these days, doesn't even the traditional client-facing positions are also very removed from the customer experience. And with just technology and with how specialized organizations get, the bigger that they get, and the more that your back office moves further in the back, and the CEOs become more of this high level, it's very easy to get disconnected from who you ultimately are serving. So even if you are traditionally that back office, or your internal client is your other team members, your ultimate client is the external client. It is the family member or the business or whomever you're actually underwriting the insurance for, underwriting for, or leading the organization for. So it's important for everybody to remember that, and not to forget to stop and take the time to get to know their customers and stop and talk with them. If they're not able to physically do that, if the CEO is not able to go and visit with customers every so often, then it's important to somehow give a voice of the customer into the organization. So whether you have a team, and it usually helps if it's a cross-department team, cross-functional team, because again, you can get a broader perspective on just understanding the customer journey, but also looking for opportunities to help the customer. Where they're going out and they're creating these opportunities to get straight from the horse's mouth, what is the customer experiencing, what are they seeing, and communicating that back to the organization. So if you have a large organization, that's one way to do it. Another way to do it is there's a lot of agencies like ours that do that voice of the customer type of work and research and can present that back. It helps sometimes to have a third party, especially if there has been a customer satisfaction issue or there's been a disconnect for a very long time. Not only for that third party perspective, but sometimes customers might be afraid to be honest if they think it might impact their relationship, if they think it might impact the quality of what they're receiving. There's certain situations where there might be privacy issues as well. And so, we can come in and do all that research anonymously and be able to aggregate that so that a lot of times when you do that, you get more honest answers. They might not be what you want to hear, but they're more honest answers that'll really help you get at the root of the problem. So that's typically what we see. It's just don't lose sight of the fact that you're ultimately doing this for your customer, no matter what your position is in the organization. Without customers, that organization does not exist.
I think that's really the bottom line is people tend to forget if you don't have happy customers, it doesn't matter how good your underwriting department is or whatever. If your customers walk away and they go, boy, I didn't really enjoy being stuck in a phone tree for 20 minutes before I actually got to talk with somebody, that doesn't make me happy. It reminded me of something when I was a child is my father was a CFO of a large movie theater chain, but what he used to do was every once in a while he would take us as a family to a movie theater and he would pay and we would get, it was great when I was a kid because we got to eat everything we wanted from the snack bar and, because he'd want to fully report on everything, how the food was and everything else. But, in retrospect, when I got older and I understood the purpose is, nobody knew who he was, but later on they would get a letter from the home office, talking about what the theater experience was and, what the pros and cons were of what was going on. And, and I think that's just brilliant. And that gets to what you're saying is that people have to think about how is a customer looking at what we're doing. And in every department, even if you think you're not having an impact on your customer is our billing department being reasonable when our client gets a late bill? What's that experience like? Can the client figure out, can they go to our website and figure out what the mailing address is or how to contact us? And especially with technology companies, I'm sure you've seen this, there's some technology companies where it's literally impossible to contact a human person. And, how do you think that's going to impact? Because I know the insurance industry is, there's a big movement towards financial tech companies, fintech. Are you familiar with fintech companies?
Yeah, and in technology in general, it's a double-edged sword. I love technology if it's used well, because what it should be doing is it should be automating the things that don't need human touch so that we can focus more on the things that do require human touch. But what we do is we either use it the other way around or we don't put the systems in place, we don't choose the right systems, and we make it to where it requires 10 times more work to do what it used to do, before when we were doing things manually. And so then it's creating more work and creating more stress and burden on the system, which also detracts from our ability to focus more on those human touch factors. And so again, technology itself is not necessarily bad. It's a tool, but it's misused so often. It should be simplifying things. It should be automating those tasks that don't require human touch so you can focus more on those human things. But you should never become so enamored with efficiency that you forget about how important that customer service is. And actually there's a huge trend right now, because I know part of it too was a lot of outsourcing was happening, and now you're having resourcing or insourcing, whatever term they want to use, because companies are finally realizing that they cut so many corners on customer service that it's starting to significantly impact them in a lot of ways. They focus so much on the client acquisition piece, but not on maintaining clients. And they tried to really make that the cheap part of the experience. And then they're constantly having to fight to get clients back, which is a lot more expensive than keeping the clients you already have. And then another point I wanted to make, because you mentioned something too about how, like with the customers that we need, one of the things that drives me crazy is when people want to put customer service as a mission. That's just the core tenet of being in business. That's not a mission of your business. That if you're not providing customer service, then why are you in business? Like at all. Like, that's not a differentiator. That's not, now there could be aspects to it, but you've got to make sure that you're putting your customer in the middle of everything that you do. The customer has got to be in the middle of your marketing. They've got to be in the middle of every decision that you make. And you have to be keeping them in view every decision that you make, every time that you do something, and thinking about how's this really going to impact the customer. You mentioned some things like the phone tree issues and the billing. We always think that actually delivering the product or the service, if that's good, everything else is fine. But it's all of these little things, it's the front 10% or the back 10% that can make or break the customer experience. And that's where we see most of the issues take place. It's not necessarily in that actual transaction, it's in the stuff leading up to it, or really quite often in the everything right after it. So like you said, the billing, always a big issue, or the phone tree items. It should not be so difficult to find someone when I have an issue. It doesn't matter how big or small your company is. I should be able to know who to call if I have a problem so I can get that problem solved. Because it's not necessarily a good customer service experience or a good customer experience in general. It's not about never having an issue. It's about what do you do when an issue arises, and how easy is it for a customer to get that solution, and how much can you reduce friction for the client. And again, we're working the opposite direction. We're trying to make things easier on us, but in the process, we're making it harder on our customers.
Definitely. Well, I know personally, I have my home and auto insurance with a traditional insurance company. It's definitely not the lowest premium, but I do know that I can reach my agent and her team at any time, and they will respond. And they may not respond with a resolution, but they'll at least respond and say, hey, we got your message, we're on it, and we'll get back to you, and we'll keep you posted about it. So how can companies and agents pivot to start using behavioral economics and client retention? How do you make that change?
Well, again, making it to where customer service and knowing and understanding the customer and delivering what the customer needs as part of your culture is critical. So, because we can come in here and we can do, customer surveys all day long, we can generate reports all day long, but if you really aren't truly making it part of your culture, you're not going to actually implement any changes based on any of the data that you get. It doesn't really do any good whatsoever. So really it has to be, and one of the core tenets is as goes the head, so goes the body. Leadership is always going to set the example. So if leadership is not making it a priority for us to truly meet the needs of our customers, then nobody else in the organization is going to do it. It's not a bottom-down effort. It's not going to come from middle management. It's not going to come from just the marketing department or just the sales department. It's got to come from the executive team, and it's got to be, prioritized all the way down. And so that's where you really have to start, is making it part of the culture of truly understanding it. And it's not doing this one-time effort. You need to have things in place that allows you to continually get that feedback, be able to, digest it, understand it, and apply it. And figuring out, sometimes you're going to get feedback that you don't need to act on. Sometimes somebody's just not ever going to be happy, or it's a one-off thing, or it's not anything you have control over. But a lot of times, if there's feedback coming in, but you're not acting on it, again, that's going to frustrate the customer too, if they can't see this leading into a different experience in the future. So being able to have the monitoring and controls in there to where you have a way to continually collect that information, be able to evaluate it, and be able to act on it. So that's part of where it does help to have that cross-functional team that is responsible for that internally, that can look at this information that's coming in, because sometimes the solution isn't going to come from the traditional place. It might come from HR, it might come from a production team, it might come from your accounting team, or it could come from an executive administrator. You never know where the solution might come from, but the more that you can have a diverse team that's working on that, the greater perspective you can have, and the greater problem solving and creativity you can have in that whole process.
Well, that's brilliant. I love all of that, and I think that's exactly changing the focus. So, do you see a trend in the financial services industry towards that end?
Not yet. There's always been kind of this movement towards having more of a customer service focus, but like you said, with a lot of the technology, the way that it's rising, it's not being properly implemented. And so again, it's not the fintech itself that's the problem, it's how it's being implemented and utilized. Too often people don't go through the whole process of properly sourcing their fintech or any technology, even if it's just their marketing technologies or whatever. So they end up with all these different pieces that don't communicate together and just create more redundancies and challenges and just bog down the system overall. And that can impact the overall customer experience. But a lot of it is, we're seeing the technology challenges, but we're also seeing there's so many other pressures that are impacting competitiveness. And so people trying to strive for competitive advantage while remaining profitable keep looking at how can they reduce costs, improve profitability. And sometimes it's at that expense of the customer service. And that's what we've seen happen quite a bit lately. Some companies are insourcing back or changing, their habits, but a lot of these cost-cutting measures have had unintended consequences. And so right now it's I think everybody's feeling the pain, but we're not seeing a trend towards a customer-centric solution yet. It's just more of everybody's feeling the pain and not understanding what it is, and still looking at it as more of a numbers issue or a sales issue or a goals issue, and not as a human issue. But it's really you're dehumanizing your entire whole process and how you connect with the client. It's going to have negative implications.
Yeah, boy, it makes me think of, I think it was James Carville who said when Bill Clinton was running for president, it's the economy, stupid, that really maybe the insurance industry and financial services industry should adopt, it's the customer, stupid. So that might be a little too blunt for some of my audience, but I think, is that sort of the bottom line?
Yeah, I mean, bottom line, you need to put the customer first, and you really need to understand your customer and their story. And you're going to have different customer segments, so their pain points are going to be different. The story you need to tell them needs to be different because of where they're at in their life and what they're facing. And so that's really got to be primary. I mean, I lived in Austin for a very long time, and they always tell you, because it's startup central. They say before you even develop a product, the first thing you need to do is go out there and do a customer surveys. You need to go out there and talk to your customers and what are their pain? What are they seeing? What are they feeling? Don't start developing products and solutions until you understand that. And so the tech companies really, more in the startup world, really understand that more than anybody else. It's just not translating into these other industries that you have to start with the customer, because that's ultimately who you're trying to serve. That's ultimately who you're wanting to purchase from you, you're wanting them to buy from you. But you can't want something from somebody until you've given something first. And you have to give value, and you have to understand what they need first to be able to give them the right value first. So I definitely think that's the starting point. Everything else from there, you're going to get, there's change management involved. You got to change your marketing message. Because I know a big trend right now, for a long time there was storytelling, but it was more of brands telling their story Well, now the storytelling needs to be the customer needs to be the hero in the story, not you. The customer needs to be the hero in the story. It's about them, not about you. It's like, and that's how it is with a lot of companies these days. It's like being in a bad relationship where you're trying to, talk to somebody and they never hear you. They never hear you because they're too busy talking about themselves. That's how most companies operate. They're too busy talking about themselves to truly hear what the customer needs and what they're saying.
Yeah, well, I've been reminded of the saying so much through this podcast is, that's why we have two ears and one mouth. So, let's pivot a little bit. You've been very active in helping women find their way in, and especially in the insurance industry, in a male-dominated industry. What are some of the unique issues for women, and how can they succeed in the financial services industry?
Right, and that's kind of it's actually a complicated answer, and I know a lot of people try to oversimplify it, and that's where I think some of the issues are coming from, is that they assume that what's holding all women back is going to be the same for all women, and it's not the case, because what the challenges are for me as a mom are different from someone who's fresh out of college and starting out, and also depending on each of the different pockets of the environment. But what we definitely need to start with by having more inclusivity. And most people misunderstand that. They think inviting somebody but expecting them to be held to, act the same or be the same as everybody else is being inclusive. And that's assimilation. You need to be inclusive means allowing a woman to be able to be a woman at the table, and, being able to have that diversity and representing your entire client base. It's not just about women, but women of color and women of different backgrounds and women at different stages of their lives, because they're going to have different challenges and different things that are influencing and holding them back. Definitely motherhood is a huge factor that affects, and certain companies are very much about hitting those quotas and working those crazy hours and not having the flexibility. But it's still a known fact that we're the primary caregivers. We're primarily ones responsible for the household. Even in a more fair relationship, I'm still constantly having to educate my own husband on what all it takes to run the household and what all it takes to make sure the kids get off to school and get picked up. And if there's an issue, I'm still the first one that's called, or those types of things. So those things impact my flexibility, but that doesn't mean that it's affecting the quality of the work that I'm producing or what I'm able to bring to the table, because we have this expectation of a very specific way of working that was designed for a worker that did not have some of these responsibilities. But it also means shifting to the other side. We also need to allow fathers to be fathers. We need to be able to have that flexibility on both sides. It can't be just flexibility for mothers. And there's been a lot of case studies and things where they do put things in place to support mothers and support working mothers in the environment that working fathers are able to take advantage of, that allows them to not only be better employees, but better fathers at home. And it feeds both ways. If you're satisfied at home, you're satisfied at work, and vice versa. And if you get to bring your best self to both situations, your just overall satisfaction is going to be better. You're going to continue to produce more, and you're just going to be just a better employee and a better staff member overall. So it's not a simple solution, but the more that we can be conscientious about having representation of women of all backgrounds in leadership roles, in all departments, that they're not relegated to administration or in the back office, that they are actually serving in a variety of roles, that they're visible. That visibility is going to continue to help. Women also need to take control of learning how to become more visible, communicating more. We just talked about this at a women's conference in February, and that was the whole theme of the entire conference is get visible. And how do you do that? And it's helping women learn how to communicate what they're bringing to the table, tooting their own horn a little bit more, and really being able to know and understand the value that they bring, and being able to also build alliances to help them do that. And so it's not a man versus woman thing. We need to be working together. And same thing among women. We need to be supporting each other. We need to be supporting our male colleagues and vice versa, anybody that's an ally for us. And then understanding again too, what are their different backgrounds and what challenges does that bring, and being able to provide resources and support, and being willing to restructure our expectations around work and what it means to produce and be a good worker. It's not necessarily that button seat scenario. It's not necessarily a very rigid, work schedule. It's not necessarily, there's just certain aspects to how we've kind of evolved and what our expectations are about what makes someone a good worker or a producer in certain areas. So often we don't actually look at what they're producing. We look at how much are they checking in, how much are they clocking in, how much are they able to be at the happy hours, how much are they able to be these certain things. And we need to change that expectation before we can get any more diversity, regardless of gender, but just any diversity in some of these more diverse roles and in some of these more leadership roles.
Well, that's powerful. And I think that does get back to a little bit of your message about the customer, is that the expectation is that people, and I think this is true of most people just innately, is that we like people who are like ourselves and feel more comfortable about them.
Mm-hmm.
But if we want to be genuinely inclusive with our clients, with our employees, is that we need to hear their story and actually take it seriously and integrate it into what we do, and think that, boy, this isn't just about us.
Mm-hmm.
This is about how women feel, as a man, how women feel. I've heard that once or twice from my wife, maybe, so
Yeah.
that I may not be listening or interpreting her reality. And so I think that's just so powerful, is to change that perspective. And and I think at the same time too is, women or anybody else who is not the majority in any situation, is that you do have to tell your story because people aren't going to know. I've been in situations, where I'm not, in the majority. I'm breaking into a new area. And so it's always, what's that message, and, I think all of us at certain points feel like, we feel a little bit like the outsider. And I know that women in business, that's a huge problem. And I'm sure you're familiar with this, is when I came into the insurance industry, women were the HR person. That was the job. If women were going to be a vice president, they were going to be the vice president of HR. And it was like, well, why? Maybe because I'm younger. I grew up, with the women being completely equal in everything they did. So, I had no, it never made sense to me. So,
no,
but I know you
I grew
faced
up at
it.
a farm where it was always all hands on deck. So when I got into the workforce, and I was like, why are all the guys over here and why are all the gals over there? Like, it never sat well with me because that's not how I was raised.
Yeah.
And one thing that you talked too about is you kind of briefly mentioned on telling your story. And that's one of the things that I think women struggle with in general. And again, this came up a lot at our conference, is they discount their experience, they discount where they're coming from, especially if you have to leave, the workforce for family reasons, or you have, we become embarrassed or kind of downplay certain things. But what you have to remember is it's your story, you own it, you get to write the story that you're going to tell, you get to write the story you're going to live. And so, don't be ashamed of, that you had to take time off to take care of family. Don't be ashamed of the fact that you can't go to every happy hour. Like I used to try and hit every happy hour, but I have 3 children and my youngest is autistic. Childcare is not easy. So I don't do happy hour events anymore. And I don't apologize for that anymore. It's my story is that after, 6 o'clock, that is time for my family. It is not time for work. And that is my story. My story is not, oh, I can't do this, I don't get to go do this. Or I had to take a year sabbatical for health reasons. It doesn't mean that, that my career is any less valued. That doesn't mean that my trajectory is off or anything like that. It's that I needed that break. It helped me re-energize, and now I'm back full force and can do these things. But so often women like downplay or talk or just demean their experience, or, just have a negative story that they tell about where they're at in their career, or what's happening to their career or what they feel is holding them back in their career, instead of changing that story and owning it and making it, putting a positive spin on it. You're not lying. You're just changing your point of view, the way that you're looking at everything. Instead of looking at it as a challenge, instead of looking at it as a roadblock, what is the opportunity? What lesson did you learn? If you had a setback, if you had to change industries, if you had to change careers, you still learned from those experiences. And those experiences still have tremendous value on where you're at today. And how are you applying that in a positive way? Focus on that story instead of focusing on the negative aspects, or, again, just, we're really good at telling bad stories about ourselves. And so that's something I think that women really need to do in terms of us, what we can control and what we can do. We can control the story that we're telling about ourselves, not only to others, but in our own heads. We need to be telling better stories to ourselves in our own heads.
Yeah, well, I think that's true of all people and everything. And, to get back to our conversation a little bit about customers, is I think that's also something with customers of financial services industry, is they tell negative stories. People talk about, the claims problem they had, or the problem when their bank overcharged them, or whatever, is that people tend to tell the most negative story. And so I think it's so powerful what you're doing is, helping people to change their point of view and to tell a better story. And that for companies, whether it's female employees or minority employees, what have you, and for their own customers is, they have a different story. And you have to understand that. And then, that we each as people have to, tell our own story. So, it's,
and own it. Don't be ashamed of it. Own it.
There you go. Own it.
Yeah.
That could be the theme. So, what have you? How do you juggle all these things? Because you've got a lot going on. That's one of questions I always ask is, how do you juggle so much?
Yeah, and I mean, it's one of those things that I feel like recently I've gotten much better at it. I've gotten really clear about what I want, what I value, and what I need to be focusing my time and energy on, and I've eliminated everything else. So there was a lot of things for a long time that I was doing because I was trying to live up to some expectation, especially in the marketing space. It's such an ego-driven industry, and there's just all these expectations that you have to be doing all these different things, and be traveling and be doing all of these speaking engagements, and be have videos going and podcasts going, and serve on X number of boards, and be seen and be seen and be seen. And I was doing all of that and running myself into the ground and not really seeing any ROI from it. So I've gotten very clear about what I enjoy, what allows me to bring my best self to the table, what's in line with my values, and what's in line with my personal and professional goals. Because I do have some very significant personal health goals right now that I'm not compromising on whatsoever. And that has allowed me to eliminate a lot of activities. So I don't do any happy hour events anymore. I significantly limit my travel to about once a month. And I am, focused on those activities that truly do allow me to connect with like-minded people, that allow me to connect with the right type of audiences and industries. And then I protect my time so that I can get my downtime. If I can rest and recharge properly, I'm so much more productive. I can get 4 times more done in the same amount of time, versus if I try and force myself to do 12 hours straight, I'm just wasting the other 4 hours. I'm not being productive at all. Whereas if I get that downtime and I have the time where I'm focused with my family and the time where I'm focused on myself, then I can come, roaring and really knock it out of the park when I come to work. So that's been the other thing, is I just don't feel pressured to serve on boards anymore, or to be present at all of these events. And I don't feel pressured to have to, glorify busy and just, work these crazy hours. I focus more on what's really going to move the needle and focus on those projects instead. And all the other stuff, I'll get to it when I get to it. The to-do list is never done. So I do as much as I can, and then make sure I have those boundaries in place. So that's something, and I've only recently started doing that, but it's made a huge difference. I feel a lot better. And I do see I'm able to bring my best self and more quality ideas and quality work to my clients, as well as to my home, to my family.
That's great. Well, I know you've given me some fantastic ideas, so I know you're delivering your best. And just to kind of close out, I also like to ask people, if they have a funny or interesting story they want to share.
Oh, that one. I was thinking about that. And I was trying to think of one that was appropriate.
Is this more of a happy hour story?
No, oh no. So I did stop drinking back in August, but and I never was a heavy drinker, but I did earn a nickname at happy hour. So one of my nicknames I earned was Shenanigans. Yeah, because people can never, after they've had a couple of drinks, no one can say my name. And so, that's one of my nicknames is Shenanigans. And most people's phones do autocorrect my name to Shenanigans too. So
funny.
It kind of stuck. So
that's
probably
great.
one of the, I guess, more tame stories I could share.
Well, we could have another podcast to talk about the rest of the stories.
Yeah, that would be a completely different podcast.
Not my usual audience.
I don't think so.
Well, this has been great. You've shared so much, and I really appreciate that. So where can people learn more about you? And I'll put any URLs in the show notes, but how can people get in touch with you and learn about what you're doing and all that?
Absolutely. So the name of our company is Connor Creative Company. Now that's Connor, that's Connor, because ever since I got remarried, no one's misspelled my first name, but they keep misspelling Connor.
Oh, funny.
Yeah. But it's connorcreativeco.com is our website. And I blog there every week. I'm constantly putting out resources and content there. Again, I'm a lifelong learner, so I'm always putting out educational content on marketing and leadership and things like that. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm very active on LinkedIn, and it's just Shennandoah Connor. I kind of, do a little bit of Twitter, not as much as I used to, but I'm also on Twitter as well. And there I'm Shennandoah TX, Shennandoah, Texas. Yeah. So those would be the big ways to reach me.
All right. Well, fantastic. I will add that to the show notes so people will be able to find you. Thanks again for coming on today. It's been a pleasure. And for everybody listening or watching, please be sure to subscribe to the podcast. Thanks again, Shennandoah. It's been a real pleasure.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tony.